I was mopping the floors in Mr. Johnson's office when I heard him say something I'll never forget. Not because he was angry. Mr. Johnson was never angry. Not because he was loud. He never raised his voice. But because he was calm. Dead calm. The kind of calm that comes right before lightning strikes. 1147 Lenox Avenue, he said to someone on the phone. That's where I keep everything that matters. The cash, the names, everything. Now, I'd been cleaning that office for 8 years, mopped every corner, dusted every surface, emptied every wastebasket. And in all that time, I'd never heard Mr. Johnson mention 1147 Lenox Avenue. Not once. But something in his voice told me that address was about to become very important to someone, and very dangerous. 3 weeks later, 6 men disappeared from Harlem. Just gone, like they'd never existed at all. No bodies, no explanations, no graves. Just empty spaces where dangerous men used to be. The police called it a mystery. The newspapers called it a crime wave. The families called it a tragedy. But I knew what it really was. I knew because I'd seen Mr. Johnson make that phone call. I knew because I'd watched him write that address on 6 different pieces of paper. I knew because I'd swept up those papers after he'd carefully placed each one where the right, wrong person would find it. What happened that night at 1147 Lenox Avenue wasn't a mystery. It wasn't random violence or gang warfare gone wrong. It was mathematics. Cold, precise, and absolutely final. Because Bumpy Johnson had asked a question, and 6 men had given him the wrong answer. They came for Bumpy Johnson's fortune. They found something else entirely. Something they couldn't buy, couldn't fight, couldn't escape. They found the answer to a question Mr. Johnson had been asking for months. Who was ready to betray him? And once Bumpy Johnson had his answer, those 6 men learned the last lesson they'd ever learn. In Harlem, there were secrets you could sell, lies you could tell, and games you could play. But there was one game you couldn't win, trying to outsmart the smartest man who ever lived. To understand what happened at that address, you have to understand Harlem in 1955. This wasn't just a neighborhood, it was an empire, Bumpy Johnson's empire, built on respect, maintained through intelligence, and protected by the absolute loyalty of people who understood that Mr. Johnson didn't just run businesses, he was the reason their businesses could exist at all. But empires, like everything else in this world, attract enemies, and by 1955, Bumpy Johnson had the most dangerous enemy of all, the Genovese crime family. Italians who looked at Harlem's profitable numbers racket and saw dollar signs, who thought that being white and connected meant they could walk into a black neighborhood and take whatever they wanted. Vito Genovese himself had put out word Harlem was opening for business, their business. The only question was whether they'd buy their way in or shoot their way in. Either way worked for them. Either way meant the end of everything Bumpy Johnson had built. But Vito Genovese made the mistake that smarter men than him had been making for 20 years. He underestimated Bumpy Johnson, thought that because Bumpy was black, because he came from the South, because he didn't wear $1,000 suits, he must not be as smart as the men who did. What Genovese didn't understand was that Bumpy Johnson played chess while other men played checkers. And in chess, sometimes you have to sacrifice pieces to win the game. The signs had been building for months. 3 operations had been raided by police at the exact moment they'd be most vulnerable. Money collections had been intercepted. Safe houses had been compromised. Information that only Bumpy's most trusted associates could know was somehow reaching hostile ears. Someone was talking. Someone close to Mr. Johnson was selling information to the highest bidder.
Someone he trusted, someone he'd protected, someone he'd treated like family, was stabbing him in the back for Italian money. Most men would have gotten angry, would have started suspecting everyone, questioning everything, destroying their own organization through paranoia and accusations. But Bumpy Johnson didn't get angry. Anger was for men who had no plan. Bumpy had something better. He had patience, and patience in his world was the deadliest weapon of all. I watched him those weeks, cleaning his office, emptying his ashtrays, listening to the calm in his voice, even when reporting the latest betrayal. He wasn't worried, wasn't stressed. If anything, he seemed satisfied, like a teacher watching a student walk into a test he'd carefully designed. Because Mr. Johnson understood something that his enemies, both inside and outside his organization, had forgotten. Information was a weapon, and weapons worked both ways. The same tool that could destroy him could be turned around and used to destroy the people trying to use it. So Bumpy Johnson decided to run an experiment, a test. He was going to find out exactly who was selling him out, and once he had that information, he was going to demonstrate why betraying Bumpy Johnson wasn't just wrong, it was fatal.
The genius of Mr. Johnson's plan wasn't in its complexity, it was in its simplicity. He was going to tell his most trusted associates a secret, a big secret, the kind of secret that men kill for. And then he was going to wait and see who couldn't keep it. Over the course of 10 days, Mr. Johnson had private conversations with 10 different men, his inner circle, his most trusted advisors, the men who knew where the money was kept, where the operations ran, where the weaknesses were hidden. To each man, he told a story, a carefully crafted story about his most valuable assets, his emergency fund, his insurance policy, his leverage against the Italian families. Everything that mattered to Bumpy Johnson, he said, was hidden in one location. But here's where Mr. Johnson showed why he was the smartest criminal who ever lived. He told each man a different location. 10 men, 10 different addresses. If anyone was selling information, he'd know exactly who it was by which address showed up in enemy hands. Except for 6 men. 6 men who Mr. Johnson had been watching more carefully than the others. 6 men whose loyalty had been questioned by recent events. 6 men who got the same false address, 1147 Lenox Avenue. I was polishing the bookshelf when he called in Vernon Hayes. Vernon had been running numbers for Mr. Johnson for 5 years. Reliable, quiet, trusted with collection routes worth thousands of dollars every week. The kind of man you'd never suspect of betrayal. "Vernon," Mr. Johnson said, his voice low and serious, "I'm trusting you with something that could get us all killed if it falls into the wrong hands." Vernon's eyes went wide. This was the kind of conversation that separated the inner circle from the employees, the kind of trust that meant respect, money, and power. 1147 Lenox Avenue, Mr. Johnson continued. That's where I keep everything that matters, the emergency cash, the account books, the photographs of dirty cops, everything the Italians would pay a fortune to get their hands on. Vernon nodded solemnly, understanding the gravity, understanding the trust, not understanding that he was holding a lit match over gasoline. "If anything happens to me," Mr. Johnson said, "that's where you go. That's where everything is hidden. But Vernon, this information dies with you. You understand?" Vernon understood, or thought he did. He walked out of that office carrying what he believed was the most valuable secret in Harlem. What he was actually carrying was his own death warrant. Over the next week, 5 more men had similar conversations. Marcus Webb, the driver who'd been acting nervous lately. Delroy Patterson, who ran a policy bank but had been asking too many questions about other operations, Earl Washington, whose bar had somehow avoided the recent police raids, Jimmy Slick Monroe, who always seemed to have more money than his position should provide, Raymond Carter, the ex-boxer who provided security but had missed the last 3 important meetings. 6 men, 1 lie, infinite possibilities for betrayal. All Mr. Johnson had to do now was wait and see which version of his false secret found its way to enemy ears, because in his experience, traitors couldn't help themselves. They were like gamblers at a rigged table. They always thought this time would be different. 2 weeks later, Juno Williams walked into Mr. Johnson's office with a report that would seal 6 men's fate. Juno ran Mr. Johnson's intelligence network, the bartenders, taxi drivers, and cleaning ladies who heard everything and saw everything but were invisible to the men they served. The Italians know about 1147 Lenox Avenue, Juno said quietly. Mr. Johnson didn't say a word, didn't ask questions, didn't seem surprised. He just nodded slowly, like a man who had finished a crossword puzzle and putting down his pen. The test was complete. The results were in. 6 men had failed in the most final way possible. Sal the Fish Marconi ran collections for the Genovese family. Not the brightest man in the organization, but reliable when it came to paying for information and acting on it quickly. When word reached him about Bumpy Johnson's secret stash house, Sal saw dollar signs and promotion opportunities. $200,000 in cash, account books with the names of every corrupt cop in Harlem, photographs of judges taking bribes. If even half of it was true, 1147 Lenox Avenue contained enough ammunition to destroy Bumpy Johnson's organization and hand Harlem to the Genovese family on a silver platter. Sal didn't hesitate. He put together a 6-man crew for the job. Professional burglars and thugs who specialized in breaking into places that weren't supposed to exist. Men who understood that some robberies required more than lockpicks and crowbars. Men who carried guns and weren't afraid to use them.
But here's what Sal Marconi didn't understand about Bumpy Johnson. Mr. Johnson had been fighting Italian families since before Sal was born, had outmaneuvered Lucky Luciano himself, had survived Dutch Schultz, Frank Costello, and every other white gangster who thought they could muscle into Harlem. Sal was bringing guns to a chess match. Meanwhile, in Harlem, the 6 men who'd sold that information were going about their lives. Vernon Hayes was collecting numbers from his regular customers. Marcus Webb was washing Mr. Johnson's Cadillac. Delroy Patterson was counting money at his policy bank. None of them knew that their names were already written in Mr. Johnson's Book of the Dead. Earl Washington was serving drinks at his bar when the call came. A voice he didn't recognize, asking if he wanted to make some real money beyond what the Italians had already paid him for the address information, money for helping with the actual robbery. Earl's greed got the better of his caution. He said yes. So did Jimmy Monroe when he got a similar call. So did Raymond Carter. 3 men who thought they were being invited to participate in the biggest score in Harlem history. What they didn't know was that those calls weren't coming from Italian gangsters. They were coming from Mr. Johnson's people. Because Bumpy Johnson wasn't content to just identify his traitors. He wanted them to convict themselves. Wanted them to walk willingly into the trap he'd prepared. Wanted them to choose their own fate with full knowledge of what they were doing. Vernon Hayes, Marcus Webb, and Delroy Patterson got different calls. Calls telling them that the Italians were moving on the Lenox Avenue location tonight. Calls suggesting that if they wanted to protect their investment, their future with the new management, they might want to be there to make sure everything went smoothly. By 8 o'clock that evening, forces were converging on 1147 Lenox Avenue from multiple directions.
6 Italian criminals expecting to find Bumpy Johnson's treasure trove, 6 traitors expecting to profit from their betrayal, and somewhere in the darkness, Bumpy Johnson's people waiting to close the trap that had been months in the making. I was cleaning late that night, working by lamplight in Mr. Johnson's office when I saw him check his watch and nod to himself. 8:47 p.m. Whatever was going to happen at 1147 Lenox Avenue was happening right now. Mr. Johnson poured himself a glass of bourbon, sat back in his chair, and waited. Not for news of success or failure, not for confirmation that his plan had worked. He was waiting for silence, because in his world, when enemies disappeared quietly, that was the loudest possible message. 1147 Lenox Avenue stood between a burned-out grocery store and a boarded-up beauty parlor. 3 stories of brick and broken windows that hadn't housed anything legal in 5 years. The perfect place to hide treasure, or secrets, or bodies. Sal Marconi's crew arrived first. 6 men in dark coats carrying the tools of their trade. Lockpicks, crowbars, flashlights, and enough firepower to handle any security they might encounter. They moved with the confidence of professionals who'd done this kind of work before. Vernon Hayes arrived 10 minutes later, parking his car 2 blocks away and walking carefully through the shadows. His heart was pounding, not from fear, from excitement. Tonight was the night he stopped being a numbers runner and became a partner in the new order. Marcus Webb and Earl Washington showed up together, having met at a diner and decided to approach as a team. Strength in numbers, they figured, safety in solidarity. They had no idea they were walking into a mathematics problem that only had one solution. By 9:15, all 12 men were inside the building. 6 Italians looking for treasure, 6 traitors looking for their future, all of them finding something completely different than they'd expected. Darkness, complete, absolute darkness, and the sound of doors slamming shut and locks clicking into place. "What the hell?" Sal Marconi started to say, but his voice was cut off by another sound, a voice they all recognized, a voice that belonged to the one man they'd thought they were stealing from. "Gentlemen?" Bumpy Johnson's voice came from somewhere in the darkness, calm, patient, almost gentle. "Welcome to 1147 Lenox Avenue. I trust you found what you were looking for." 12 men reached for guns, found them, drew them, started shooting at shadows and echoes and the realization that they'd walked into a trap that had been months in the making. But in that warehouse, in that darkness, 12 guns meant nothing, because Bumpy Johnson wasn't fighting them with weapons. He was fighting them with architecture, with preparation, with the simple fact that he knew every inch of that building, and they knew nothing. The warehouse had been prepared for this moment. Every entrance sealed, every window barred, every potential hiding spot mapped and controlled. What looked like one large room was actually a maze of catwalks, storage areas, and false walls that only someone with intimate knowledge of the building could navigate. "You came for my money," Mr. Johnson's voice continued, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. "But you forgot something. This is my house, and in my house, I decide who leaves." Vernon Hayes fired wildly at the sound of Mr. Johnson's voice, hit nothing but air and brick, heard footsteps behind him and spun around, finger on the trigger, saw a shadow that might have been Marcus Webb or might have been death itself. Earl Washington tried to reach the door they'd entered through, found it locked, barred, impossible to open from the inside, realized that 1147 Lenox Avenue wasn't a treasure house, it was a tomb, and they'd bought their own burial plots with their betrayal. One by one, the sounds of struggle faded. One by one, the gunshots stopped. One by one, 12 dangerous men learned the final lesson Bumpy Johnson would ever teach them. When silence finally fell over 1147 Lenox Avenue, it was complete. No voices, no movement, no life. Just the sound of rain on the roof and the distant jazz music that was always playing somewhere in Harlem. The next morning, 12 wives woke up to empty beds. 12 families started their day wondering why their men hadn't come home. 12 sets of children asked where Daddy was and got answers that nobody believed. Vernon Hayes' wife, Martha, made his coffee the way she did every morning, set it on the table next to his newspaper, waited for him to come downstairs. When he didn't, she called his friends, his associates, the people who might know where he'd gone or when he might be back. Nobody knew anything. Nobody had seen Vernon since yesterday evening. Nobody had any idea where he might have gone or why he wouldn't have called. By noon, 6 families had filed missing person reports with the police. 6 grown men, all known associates of Bumpy Johnson, all vanished without a trace on the same night. The police started asking questions, started looking for patterns, started wondering if this was gang warfare or something else entirely. But the police never found anything, never discovered any evidence of foul play, never located any witnesses to whatever had happened to 6 men who'd simply disappeared from the face of the earth. 1147 Lenox Avenue sat exactly as it had for 5 years, empty, abandoned, showing no signs that 12 men had entered it and none had left. Whatever had happened in that building, whoever was responsible, they'd been thorough enough to erase every trace of their work. In the Italian social clubs of Little Italy, different questions were being asked. Sal Marconi and his crew had vanished while pursuing what should have been a simple burglary. 6 professional criminals, armed and experienced, gone without a word, without a fight, without any explanation at all. The message was clear, even if the method remained hidden. Bumpy Johnson had cleaned house, not just of the traitors in his own organization, but of the enemies who tried to exploit those traitors. He'd solved 2 problems with 1 solution and done it so quietly that nobody could prove anything had happened at all. In Harlem, the whispers started. Old-timers talking in low voices about the night 6 men went looking for treasure and found judgment instead. About addresses that existed but didn't exist. About Bumpy Johnson's ability to make problems disappear so completely that you wondered if they'd ever been real at all. Martha Hayes waited 15 years for her husband to come home. Every Christmas, she set his place at the dinner table. Every birthday, she bought him a card she never sent. Every anniversary, she wore the dress he'd liked best and sat by the window watching for a man who was never coming back. Marcus Webb's mother told everyone her son was on an extended business trip, kept telling that story until the day she died, 23 years later. Never admitted that her boy was gone, never stopped believing that someday he'd walk through that door with flowers and apologies and explanations that would make everything make sense. The other families had their own ways of coping with the silence. Earl Washington's wife eventually remarried. Jimmy Monroe's children grew up telling people their father was in the military overseas. Raymond Carter's mother held a funeral with an empty casket just to have somewhere to bring flowers. But Delroy Patterson's family never gave up searching. His brother spent 30 years following rumors, chasing stories, interviewing anyone who might know what had happened that night. He never found a single clue, never discovered even the smallest piece of evidence that might explain where 6 men had gone or why they'd never come back. Because Bumpy Johnson didn't leave clues, didn't create evidence, didn't provide closure or explanations or comfort to the families of men who'd betrayed him. He simply solved problems and moved on, leaving behind only silence and the kind of fear that comes from not knowing exactly how someone can make people disappear so completely. The old-timers in Harlem still talk about that night when they think nobody's listening. They call it the cleaning. 6 men walked into an address that shouldn't have existed and walked into history, not as legends, as warnings. They tell the story to young men who think they're smart enough to play games with people smarter than them, who believe they can take shortcuts to power and success, who imagine they can betray trust without consequences and sell loyalty to the highest bidder. The story always ends the same way. Bumpy Johnson didn't need to make speeches about loyalty, didn't need to threaten people or make examples or explain the consequences of betrayal. He just needed to ask a question and wait for the wrong answer. And when the wrong answer came, he provided a response that was swift, final, and so complete that it became a legend. A reminder that in Harlem, in his world, patience wasn't a virtue, it was a verdict. And verdicts, once delivered, couldn't be appealed. Today, 1147 Lenox Avenue is a parking lot. The building was torn down in 1972. Whatever happened in that warehouse, whatever became of the men who entered it, went down with the bricks and mortar. The only witnesses are the people who remember the questions without answers, and the families who still wonder why their men never came home. But the lesson remains. In barbershops and corner stores, in policy banks and jazz clubs, old men still tell the story of the night Bumpy Johnson gave his enemies a secret address, and 6 men who thought they were smart enough to betray him learned that some secrets are worth dying for. If this story taught you something about loyalty, about consequences, about the difference between being clever and being wise, then subscribe to this channel. Hit that like button if you understand that trust, once broken, can never be repaired. And tell me in the comments, would you have taken that information to Bumpy Johnson's enemies, or would you have kept his secret, even if it cost you money? 6 men thought they had the right answer. 6 families are still waiting for them to come home. Remember, in Harlem, every secret was a test, and Bumpy Johnson was grading on a curve where failure meant more than a bad grade. It meant disappearing forever.